in the secluded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where ancient mountains hold fog-like secrets on graves, you can find a family tree that doesn't branch. Instead, it spirals inward, coiling back on itself in ways nature never meant. For 7 generations, the same surnames appear again and again, marrying one another, bearing children who carried the weight of their ancestors' choices within their very blood. What you are going to hear is not folklore. It is not legend. This is a documented history that most would rather forget, a genealogical nightmare stretching across 2 centuries, revealing what occurs when isolation, tradition, and desperation collide within the shadows of Appalachia. Hello everyone. Before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. This tells YouTube to keep showing you stories like this one. The year was 1820, and the mountains of eastern Kentucky formed a world of their own. Here, within the maze of valleys and ridges that seemed to exist outside of time, families didn't merely settle. They became trapped by geography, by poverty, and by a fierce independence that would become both their strength and their curse. The Colts were among these early settlers, a family whose name would later become synonymous with one of the most disturbing genetic experiments in American history, though they never saw it as such. Samuel Colt came to these mountains with his wife Martha, seeking the promise of cheap land and freedom from civilization's judgments. What they discovered was an isolation so complete that the outside world may as well have ceased to be. Their closest neighbors were hours away by horseback, reachable only by treacherous mountain paths that became impassable in winter. Inside this cocoon of solitude, the Colts began to build their dynasty, unaware they were laying the foundation for generations of genetic horror. Samuel and Martha raised 7 children, and as these children reached adulthood in the 1840s and 1850s, they confronted a dilemma that would define their family's fate. Marriage required partners, yet partners were scarce in these remote mountains. The few neighboring families were either too distant, too hostile, or already interrelated through earlier unions. So the Colt children started to look inward, to each other, and to their cousins. It began, innocently enough, with second cousins marrying, a practice not unusual in rural communities of that era. But what started as necessity would evolve into something far more sinister. The Colt family's first documented case of close inbreeding happened in 1855, when James Colt married his first cousin, Elizabeth Colt. Their union produced 6 children, all of whom showed what local doctors of the time called peculiar constitutions. This was a euphemism for the genetic abnormalities already beginning to appear. But the family, isolated from medical knowledge and driven by tradition, saw nothing wrong. In fact, they viewed it as keeping their bloodline pure, preserving their mountain heritage from outside contamination. They had no grasp of genetics, no understanding of the terrible price their descendants would pay. By the 1870s, the Colts' second generation had come of age, and the pattern their parents established had become not just accepted, but expected. What was once born of necessity was now tradition, as sacred and unquestioned as Sunday service or planting crops by the moon. The children of James and Elizabeth Colt, themselves the product of a first cousin marriage, now faced their own futures in marriage, with options limited to their immediate family circle. They continued the cycle with a determination that verged on religious fervor. Thomas Colt, son of James and Elizabeth, married his sister Mary in 1878. Their union was celebrated by the family as a way to keep their mountain bloodline strong. But the children born from this marriage told a different story. Of their 8 offspring, 3 died in infancy from mysterious ailments local physicians could not identify or treat. The 5 surviving children displayed increasingly severe physical and mental abnormalities, clubfoot cleft palates, and what the family referred to with the euphemism slow thinking. Yet instead of questioning their matrimonial practices, The Colts doubled down, interpreting these challenges as tests of their faith and endurance. The isolation that had once shielded the family from outside judgment had now become a prison of ignorance. Doctors did not regularly visit these remote hollows. Government officials kept no records of births or deaths. No social workers investigated the children's welfare. The Colts lived in a bubble of their own making, where their increasingly disturbing family structure went, not just unnoticed, but unchallenged. They formed their own explanations for their children's ailments: bad air from the mines, curses from rival families, the will of God testing their resolve. Sarah Colt, daughter of Thomas and Mary, married her uncle Benjamin in 1895, creating a genetic knot that pulled tighter with every generation. Their children, products of both sibling and uncleness inbreeding, began to show what can only be called severe genetic breakdown. Mental disabilities grew more pronounced, physical deformities more extreme. Several children were born with missing or malformed limbs. Others exhibited profound intellectual disabilities that left them entirely dependent on family care for their entire lives. Yet the most chilling aspect wasn't the genetic damage itself, it was the family's adaptation to it. They established a hierarchy where the more normal children cared for the severely disabled, where deformity was expected and abnormality was just another mouth to feed. They developed their own crude medical care and their own explanations for conditions that would have horrified trained physicians. The Colt family had turned into a closed system, feeding on itself, growing more distorted each generation, all while maintaining the illusion that this was simply their way of life. As the 20th century began, the Colt's third generation represented something never before seen in documented American history. A family so genetically compromised they had essentially become a separate subspecies. They were isolated not just by geography, but by the accumulating damage of decades of inbreeding. The children born in the 1900s and 1910s were living testaments to what happens when the laws of genetics are systematically violated for nearly a century. Daniel Colt, born in 1902 to Sarah and her uncle Benjamin, married his own sister Ruth in 1920. By this point, the family's gene pool had become so restricted that finding any partner who wasn't a close relative was virtually impossible. Every eligible person in their isolated community was already related through multiple prior unions. Their wedding, held in the same mountain cabin where their grandparents had started this genetic spiral, was attended by relatives who were simultaneously cousins, aunts, uncles, and siblings to both the bride and groom. The children of Daniel and Ruth represented a new low in human genetic diversity. Of 12 pregnancies, only 7 children survived to adulthood, and those who did displayed abnormalities so severe they needed constant care. 3 were born deaf and mute. 2 had severe intellectual disabilities that left them functioning at a toddler's level well into adulthood. 1 child, Martha, was born with such extreme physical deformities. She never learned to walk and spent her entire life confined to a wooden crate that served as both bed and wheelchair. What makes this period especially horrifying is the documentation that survived. A traveling missionary named Reverend Samuel McKinney visited the Colt settlement in 1925 and kept detailed records of what he saw. His journal, discovered decades later in a church archive, describes scenes that read like something from a Gothic nightmare. He wrote of adults who communicated mainly through grunts and gestures, of children with faces so malformed he initially mistook them for victims of a terrible accident, of a family structure so confused that siblings were raising children who were simultaneously their offspring, nieces, nephews, and grandchildren. McKinney's most disturbing observation was the family's complete normalization of these conditions. They showed no shame, no recognition their situation was anything but natural. When he suggested that marrying outside the family might improve the children's health, the eldest patriarch, then in his 70s, explained with genuine bewilderment that outsiders were different people who might weaken the blood. They had crafted their own reality, where genetic catastrophe was simply the price of maintaining racial purity, where deformity was evidence of their family's unique heritage rather than a sign of its destruction. The Reverend fled the settlement after only 3 days, but not before documenting what may be the most comprehensive early account of extreme inbreeding in American history. His journals reveal a family that had moved beyond merely marrying cousins. They had created a closed genetic loop where the same damaged DNA was recycled endlessly, amplifying defects each generation while eliminating any chance of genetic rescue. The 1930s brought the Great Depression to America, and with it, the first government programs that would eventually reach even the most remote corners of Appalachia. It was during this time that the Colt family's genetic nightmare finally caught the outside world's attention, not through humanitarian concern, but through a medical survey conducted by the Works Progress Administration. What the researchers found would challenge everything the medical establishment thought it knew about the limits of human genetic degradation. Dr. Harold Whitman, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky, was part of a team surveying rural populations for hereditary diseases. When local officials mentioned strange rumors about a family deep in the mountains where everyone looked the same, Whitman initially dismissed it as mountain folklore. But in the summer of 1936, he made the treacherous journey to the Colt settlement. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his career. His official report, buried in government archives for decades, reads like a medical horror story. The 4th generation of Colts, now adults in their 20s and 30s, displayed genetic damage so severe that Whitman initially questioned if they belonged to the same species as normal humans. He documented cases of microcephaly, so extreme that adult heads were smaller than those of typical infants. He found individuals with extra fingers and toes, not the simple polydactyly seen occasionally in normal populations, but grotesque protrusions of bone and flesh that seemed to sprout randomly from hands and feet. Most disturbing were the facial deformities, features so distorted that family members were often unrecognizable as human from certain angles. Robert Colt, born in 1915 to Daniel and his sister Ruth, had married his own daughter Susan in 1934. Their children represented a genetic dead end, the product of so many generations of inbreeding that their DNA had essentially collapsed in on itself. Of their 6 children, 2 were born without eyes, their skulls smooth where eye sockets should have been. Another was born with what appeared to be a second, partially formed torso, growing from his chest. One child lived to age 12 despite being born with her internal organs reversed, a condition so rare, Dr. Whitman had never encountered it in his 20-year career. But the most chilling discovery wasn't the physical abnormalities. It was the family's adaptation to them. They had developed their own crude medical practices and their own explanations for conditions that defied medical understanding. Children born with severe intellectual disabilities were assigned specific roles in the family hierarchy, often used as entertainment for the more functional members. Those with physical deformities were hidden away during the day but brought out for family gatherings where their conditions were celebrated as evidence of their bloodline's pesset. Dr. Whitman's report recommended immediate intervention, including forced sterilization and removing children to state custody. But the remote location and the family's fierce resistance to outsiders meant his recommendations were never implemented. The Colt family continued their genetic spiral, now 4 generations deep in a pit of hereditary damage that seemed to have no bottom. Whitman himself suffered a nervous breakdown 6 months after his visit and spent the rest of his career studying fruit flies, claiming he could never again work with human subjects. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. By the 1940s and 1950s, the Colt's 5th generation had achieved something that should have been biologically impossible. They had survived despite carrying genetic damage so severe that most of their children should never have lived past infancy. Yet, they endured, creating a living laboratory of human genetic extremes that operated in complete secrecy in the Kentucky mountains. Their survival was not a testament to human resilience, but to something far darker, a family's complete abandonment of natural selection in favor of genetic suicide. James Colt, 3, born in 1928, was the product of 5 generations of continuous inbreeding. His parents were Robert and his daughter Susan, making James simultaneously his own great-uncle and the son of a father-daughter union. By the time he reached adulthood in the late 1940s, James displayed the accumulated genetic damage of his lineage, severe intellectual disability, partial blindness, and a spinal curvature so extreme that he walked permanently bent at a 90-degree angle. In 1950, he married his sister Patricia, and their union would produce what may be the most genetically compromised children in recorded human history. Their first child, born in 1951, lived only 3 hours. The infant's skull had failed to close properly, leaving the brain exposed and malformed. Their second child, Mary, survived but was born without a functioning digestive system. She lived for 2 years, sustained entirely by liquid nutrition administered through a tube the family had fashioned from stolen medical supplies. The third child, Samuel, was born with a condition so rare it had no medical name. His bones grew continuously throughout his life, creating grotesque protrusions that eventually made any movement impossible. What makes this generation particularly horrifying is the detailed records kept by Patricia herself. Unlike her ancestors, she had learned to read and write, and she maintained a journal that documented every birth, death, and deformity with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recording livestock breeding. Her entries, discovered after her death, reveal a woman who had completely dissociated from the horror of her situation. She wrote about children born without limbs as casually as someone might note the weather, and described the death of infants with the same emotional detachment as recording a grocery list. The family had by now developed elaborate rituals around their genetic failures. Children who died within the first year were buried in unmarked graves behind the family cabin, their deaths unreported to any authority. Those who survived with severe disabilities were assigned numbers rather than names, reducing them to inventory in the family's twisted system. The more functional family members began to see themselves as caretakers of a sacred bloodline, preserving something precious rather than perpetuating something monstrous. Most disturbing was their increasing isolation from reality itself. They had created their own language, their own customs, their own explanations for the world. They believed their genetic conditions were evidence of their family's divine selection, that they were evolving into something higher than ordinary humans. They spoke of themselves as the chosen people of the mountain, destined to inherit the earth through their genetic purity. The delusion had become so complete that they genuinely believed their deformities were signs of superiority rather than evidence of genetic collapse. The 1960s and 1970s witnessed the 6th and 7th generations of Colts, and by this point, the family had transcended the boundaries of medical possibility. They had become living proof that human genetics could be pushed far beyond what nature intended, creating beings that existed in a twilight zone between life and death, between human and something else entirely. These final generations represented not just the culmination of 7 generations of inbreeding, but the complete breakdown of the genetic code that defines our species. Timothy Colt, born in 1955 to James and his sister Patricia, married his own mother in 1975. By this time, the family's understanding of relationships had become so distorted that the concept of incest had lost all meaning. They were simply breeding from whatever genetic material remained available. Their children, born in the late 1970s, displayed genetic damage so severe that several were born with conditions never before documented in medical literature. One child was born with 2 hearts, both struggling to pump blood through a circulatory system that couldn't support dual organs. Another was born with a brain so malformed it resembled coral rather than neural tissue. The 7th generation, born in the 1980s and 1990s, marked the effective end of the Colt bloodline. These children, if they can be called children, were born with genetic defects so extreme that most died within days of birth. Those who survived did so in a state that challenged the very definition of human consciousness. They couldn't speak, recognize faces, or perform basic functions like eating or eliminating waste without assistance. They existed in a vegetative state that was neither truly alive nor mercifully dead. Sarah Colt, born in 1978, was perhaps the last functional member of the family line. She possessed enough mental capacity to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with her family, but lacked the ability or resources to break the cycle. In a journal entry from 1995, she wrote, "The babies keep coming out wrong. They don't look like babies. They don't sound like babies. Sometimes I think we're being punished for something, but I don't know what." She died in 2001, childless, marking the effective end of the Colt family's genetic experiment. By the early 2000s, the surviving members of the family could no longer reproduce. The men had become sterile through genetic damage, and the women could not carry pregnancies to term. The few remaining family members, perhaps a dozen individuals scattered across the original settlement, existed in a state of biological limbo. They were human in name only, their genetic heritage so damaged that they represented a dead-end branch of human evolution, a cautionary tale written in DNA. Local authorities, who eventually discovered the settlement in 2003, described it as resembling a scene from a post-apocalyptic nightmare. The family members who remained were so physically and mentally compromised that they required immediate medical intervention just to survive. Most were transferred to long-term care facilities, where they lived out their remaining years under assumed names, their true identities buried along with their family's dark secret. The settlement itself was abandoned, left to be reclaimed by the Kentucky wilderness that had hidden its horrors for nearly 2 centuries. Today, the Colt settlement stands empty, a collection of rotting cabins slowly being consumed by the Kentucky wilderness. But the legacy of what happened there continues to haunt geneticists, anthropologists, and medical researchers who study the case files finally declassified in 2010. The Colt family represents the most extreme documented case of human inbreeding in recorded history, a 7-generation experiment in genetic degradation that pushed the boundaries of what the human genome could endure before complete collapse. The medical records, when finally compiled and analyzed, revealed patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about human genetics. The Colts had survived conditions that should have been immediately fatal, developed crude adaptations to genetic damage that defied medical understanding, and created a family structure so distorted it resembled something from evolutionary biology rather than human sociology. Their case has become a cornerstone study in genetic research, referenced in medical schools and research institutions as an example of the absolute limits of human genetic tolerance. But perhaps most disturbing is what the Colt family reveals about the human capacity for self-deception. For 7 generations, they maintained the belief that they were preserving something sacred, something pure, even as the evidence of their genetic destruction accumulated around them. They created elaborate mythologies to explain their condition, developed rituals to celebrate their deformities, and convinced themselves that their suffering was evidence of their divine selection rather than their genetic suicide. Psychological profiles of the surviving family members, conducted during their brief time in state custody, revealed minds so disconnected from reality that they inhabited what psychiatrists described as a parallel universe of delusion. They spoke of their dead children as having returned to the mountain spirits, described their deformities as marks of the chosen, and maintained until their deaths that they were the inheritors of a superior bloodline that ordinary humans couldn't understand. The last known survivor of the Colt family, a woman identified only as patient C47 in medical records, died in a Kentucky state care facility in 2019. She was the great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of the original Samuel and Martha Colt, carrying in her damaged DNA the accumulated genetic errors of 7 generations of inbreeding. Her death marked the official end of a bloodline that had persisted for nearly 2 centuries in complete isolation from the outside world. The mountain settlement where the Colts lived has been sealed off by state authorities, declared a biological hazard site due to contamination from improperly disposed medical waste and human remains. Local legends speak of strange sounds echoing from the abandoned cabins and of visitors who claim to see figures moving through the ruins. But these are just stories, whispers in the wind. The real horror of the Colt family lies not in ghostly apparitions, but in the documented reality of what human beings can become when genetics, isolation, and delusion converge in the darkness of places the outside world chooses to forget. Their story serves as a reminder that some secrets are buried, not because they're untrue, but because they're too terrible for civilized society to acknowledge. The Colt family existed, they suffered, and they died, leaving behind a genetic legacy that will be studied for generations as a cautionary tale of what happens when the laws of nature are systematically violated in the name of preserving bloodline purity. In the end, they achieved the opposite of what they sought, not genetic superiority, but genetic extinction, written in the language of human suffering across 7 generations of darkness. The story of the Colts does not end with the sealing of their settlement or the quiet deaths of the last survivors in state care. Their legacy, etched not in stone but in twisted DNA, has become a dark cornerstone of modern science, a ghost that continues to walk the halls of genetics and ethics. In the years following the declassification of the case files, a team of geneticists from a leading university embarked on a controversial project to create a full genomic map of the Colt bloodline using preserved tissue samples from the last survivors. What they uncovered was a biological nightmare far beyond their initial hypotheses. The Colt genome was a shattered mirror, reflecting the same catastrophic errors across nearly every chromosome. They identified over 200 rare recessive disorders that had been expressed, a number that defied all statistical probability. But the true horror was in the novel mutations, genetic mistakes so unique they have been designated with Colt-specific nomenclature in medical literature, Colt syndrome 1, Colt syndrome 2, and so on. These were not just combinations of known diseases, but entirely new pathologies born from the utter collapse of genetic diversity. The human body, it seems, when pushed beyond a certain threshold, can invent entirely new ways to fail. The psychological analysis of the case has been equally profound. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a specialist in isolated communities, spent years analyzing the journals of Patricia Colt and the testimony of Sarah Colt. Her research suggests the family didn't just believe their delusions. Their reality had been so completely shaped by isolation and reinforced by their unique social structure that their worldview was, to them, as logical as ours is to us. They created a cosmology where pain was sacred and deformity was divine, Dr. Vance wrote. This wasn't insanity in the clinical sense. It was the emergence of a complete, alternative culture built around a central, catastrophic error. The most terrifying part is how rational it must have seemed from the inside. The settlement's land itself remains a subject of macabre fascination and legal debate. Declared a biological hazard, it is officially off-limits, patrolled by county officials. Yet, the Colt curse has entered local folklore. Hunters tell stories of dogs that whimper, and refuse to enter certain hollows. Hikers report a profound, unnatural silence and the unsettling feeling of being watched from the decaying cabins. While most of this is easily dismissed as superstition, environmental surveys have confirmed strangely elevated levels of heavy metals in the soil and water, likely from the family's crude attempts at mining and their improper disposal of waste. The land, like the family, bears scars that will not quickly heal. The ethical questions the Colt case raises are perhaps its most enduring and troubling legacy. What is the government's responsibility when a community's freedom and isolation lead to its self-destruction? At what point does cultural sovereignty surrender to the imperative to prevent human suffering? These are questions without easy answers. The Colt family was a living, breathing entity that, for generations, operated by its own rules. Any intervention would have been a violent imposition from the outside world they so deeply distrusted. Yet, the cost of non-intervention was 7 generations of profound agony. The final, chilling chapter of the Colt story may still be written in the realm of science. Their unique, devastated genome is now a digital ghost, a dataset stored on secure servers, studied by researchers investigating the absolute limits of human heredity. In a sterile laboratory far from the Kentucky mountains, a scientist might one day isolate the specific mutation that caused the coral-like brain growth or the reversed organs, not to replicate it, but to understand the fundamental mechanisms of human development it disrupted. In this paradoxical way, the Colt's suffering, born from a rejection of the outside world, has become a key that might unlock medical mysteries for that same world. The last surviving Colt, patient C-47, never knew her real name or her family's history. She lived and died knowing only the gentle, impersonal care of her nurses. There is a profound silence at the end of this bloodline. No proud descendants, no family reunions, no legacy, but a warning. The mountains of eastern Kentucky are older than memory, and they keep their secrets well. But the story of the Colt family is a fissure in that silence, a chilling whisper on the wind that speaks of the fragile thread of our genetics, the danger of closed circles, and the terrifying human capacity to normalize our own destruction. Theirs is a history written in a language of suffering we are only just beginning to decipher, a dark testament to the fact that the purest bloodline leads only to one inevitable destination: extinction. This deciphering of the Colt legacy has begun to ripple outwards, influencing fields far beyond clinical genetics and ethics. The case has become a dark, unavoidable touchstone in our understanding of human society itself. Anthropologists now study the Colt settlement not as an American anomaly, but as a terrifying case study in microcultural evolution. They posit that the Colts created what is known as a closed cultural system, a society so insulated that it developed its own immutable laws, language, and creation myths, all built upon the foundational principle of blood purity. This was not merely inbreeding. It was the birth of a clan-based civilization that flourished in its own decay, a perverted mirror of how all human cultures form, but with a fatal, recursive flaw at its core: the family's invented vocabulary. Partially reconstructed from the journals, reveals a worldview completely untethered from ours. Words for common objects were replaced. A child born wrong was not a tragedy but a stone child, considered to be a spiritual anchor for the family. A successful birth was a Clearwater, seen as a blessing but also, disturbingly, as a potential dilution of their sacred, mountain-thick blood. Their calendar was not based on seasons alone, but on the comings and goings of their own genetic afflictions, creating a cyclical understanding of time where suffering was not an interruption of life, but a fundamental part of its rhythm. This cultural analysis leads to an even more unsettling question: were the Colts, in their final generations, even truly human in the sociological sense? Philosophers and cognitive scientists debate this point. Their capacity for complex language had degraded. Their social structures were based on biological imperatives that defied universal human taboos. Their perception of reality was shaped by a shared delusion so complete it formed a consensus. They had, in effect, speciated in their isolation, not biologically, but culturally and cognitively. They became a people apart, a haunting example of how quickly the foundations of humanity can erode when deprived of external input. The legal ramifications continue to unfold. The Colt case is now cited in precedent-setting court. Battles over the rights of isolated religious communities and the state's parents' patria authority to protect children from their parents' beliefs. It is the extreme example lawyers use to test the limits of freedom versus welfare. Where do you draw the line? A judge might ask, and the shadow of the Colt family settlement is the unspoken answer in the room. Their story established that a line does, in fact, exist, and that crossing it leads to a place from which there is no return. And what of the land itself? The biological hazard designation is due for review, but the debate is fierce. Some argue for a controlled demolition of the remaining structures, a literal and symbolic erasure of the horror. Others, including historians and a contingent of ethnics, propose the opposite, preserving the site as a national historic landmark, not to honor the Colts, but to forever enshrine the consequences of their choices. They argue that the rotting cabins are a monument more powerful than any statue, a visceral, terrifying warning to future generations, a place where students of medicine, law, and sociology could bear witness to the end result of absolute isolation and genetic entropy. Meanwhile, the digital ghosts of the Colts continue their posthumous existence. Their genomic data is now part of a global research project mapping human genetic resilience. In a final, bitter irony, the very impurities the Colts fought so hard to avoid are the key to human survival. By studying the catastrophic absence of genetic diversity in the Colt line, scientists are better understanding why diversity is so vital, identifying the specific genes that, when varied, protect against a host of diseases. The Colt family, who believed in their own superiority, has become science's most powerful example of the strength found in difference. The fog still clings to the ancient mountains of eastern Kentucky. The hollows remain deep and shadowed, but the silence there is different now. It is a silence that has been measured, documented, and analyzed. It is a silence that speaks. It tells a story not of ghosts, but of choices. It whispers of the fine line between tradition and trap, between faith and folly, between a family tree and a noose. The Colts are gone, but their story is now a permanent part of our own human genome, recessive gene of caution in our collective consciousness, waiting to be expressed, lest we ever forget what happens when the world is closed, and the blood turns back upon itself. This permanent etching of the Colt narrative into our collective consciousness has begun to manifest in unexpected and often unsettling ways. The story, once a buried secret of the Appalachian hollows, has escaped the confines of academic journals and leaked into the broader culture, mutating as it spreads in the world of literature and film. The Colt family has become a dark archetype. Fictionalized accounts, often titled with variations of the hollow or mountain blood, appear with regularity. While most are sensationalized horror, a few have grasped the deeper tragedy. They explore the psychological terror not of monsters, but of a love so twisted by circumstance that it becomes a weapon against the self. The most poignant of these works focus on figures like Sarah Colt IV, the ones with just enough clarity to see the prison walls but not enough strength to break them down. These characters have become symbols for a very modern kind of despair, the agony of understanding a systemic wrong while being utterly powerless to stop it. Online, the story has taken on a life of its own. In the darker corners of the internet, the Colts have been adopted as a perverse mascot by extremist groups advocating for racial purity. They grotesquely misinterpret the lesson, pointing to the family's downfall not as a consequence of inbreeding, but as a result of their failure to remain genetically strong. Stunning and willful misreading of the facts that highlights the very delusional thinking that doomed the family in the first place. Conversely, in scientific and skeptic communities, the Colt case is the ultimate rebuttal. A trump card played to instantly dismantle any argument for eugenics or pure bloodlines. Their 7-generation experiment is the data-driven, irrefutable proof of its catastrophic end. This cultural seepage has a tangible effect. Genetic counselors now report that clients from isolated communities, upon learning they may be distant relatives, often reference the Colt story. It has become a shared shorthand for a fear they could not previously articulate. "We don't want to end up like the Colts," is a phrase that has motivated individuals to seek genetic testing and broaden their social circles, directly impacting personal decisions and breaking cycles of isolation. In this sense, the family's tragedy is performing a final, redemptive service, acting as a cautionary tale that is actively preventing similar fates. Yet, the land itself holds its secrets tight. Recent, more sensitive geological surveys have suggested that the bad air and curses the Colts blamed for their ailments may have had a grain of truth not from spirits, but from the ground. The settlement was situated over a slow, natural seep of methane and hydrogen sulfide gas, a known neurotoxin that can cause headaches, dizziness, and cognitive impairment. While it in no way explains the genetic collapse, researchers now theorize that this constant, low-level exposure may have exacerbated the family's existing conditions and contributed to the collective, neurological decline that cemented their delusions. The mountain, in a sense, was indeed poisoning them, adding a layer of environmental fatalism to their already grim narrative. The final, ongoing chapter is perhaps the most metaphysical. What is our responsibility to the memory of the Colts? They were victims of their ancestors' choices, prisoners of geography, and architects of their own ruin. Do we remember them as monsters, as victims, or as both? A movement, led by a coalition of bioethicists and Appalachian historians, has proposed a simple, unmarked stone memorial to be placed at the edge of the restricted zone. It would bear no family name, only a single, stark line from Sarah Colt IV's journal: "The babies keep coming out wrong." This would not be a tribute, but a testament to suffering, a quiet, permanent marker bearing witness to the price of forgetting the world outside one's own door. The Colt family is gone. Their genetic line has vanished from the earth. But they have achieved a form of immortality they never could have imagined. They live on in our laws, in our art, in our science, and in our nightmares. They are the dark reflection in the still mountain water, a reminder that the greatest terrors are not the ones that lurk in the shadows, but the ones we cultivate in the light of our own convictions, watered by isolation and pruned by tradition, until the garden itself becomes a wilderness from which there is no escape.